So the cool thing is, if you ever travel south of the United States, you can see much of the regions that we are going to address. However, the people who lived there were far removed from the colonialized version that they represent now as a result of the Spanish. Um, they have maintained some of their culture, and you can still find some remnants of the earlier tribes, the Mayan and such. But ultimately, there was a major shift that took place when Columbus landed on this part of the world, and the Spanish took over and conquered the people. So this portion of lecture is going to deal with what we call pre-Columbian, meaning before Columbus, and we're going to look at Mesoamerica and South America. So that includes regions of Mexico, Central and South America. We're going to look at what is called the Classic period, and then some period after the Classic period called the Post-Classic period era. So starting off, first thing we could do is say, here is what it looks like when Columbus arrives. Maybe. I mean, it probably didn't look exactly like that. This is clearly an impressionist sort of piece, and but it probably wouldn't be too far from the truth. Everything here is deliberately painted in such a way. If you can look into the background on the right side of the panel, you can clearly see the natives not quite sure what to do with themselves, naked, one man hiding, bowing down, maybe thinking that they're gods, others hiding behind the tree. This is what it looked like basically when Columbus came to the New World. Now, the world may have been new to Columbus and the Spanish, but it was not new to those who lived there. It was just the world that they lived in. So before we get into really diving into the lecture, this is kind of what we would have seen in chapter 1, early on in the textbook somewhere, depending on which textbook this lecture will relate to. Mostly, I use two different books, but both books use in the beginning cultures to talk, the very earliest of culture and civilization, we find the Olmecs. But let's see. So the preceding cultures of what we're going to talk about would have been the Olmecs. But really we're going to look at this region, like I said. So the cultures of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, Nicaragua, what we would find today is Nicaragua, Honduras, the Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico. But there was, of course, a history before what we're going to talk about. We would find that with the Olmecs. Mesoamerican culture flourished for a period of probably about 1,000 years, which would have been 250 BCE to 900 CE. So we call this the Classic era. We call this the Pre-Columbian era because this is when the time existed before Columbus, before 1492. We borrow this terminology, of course, which is a little bit of twist of irony. It's a very European concept to say classic. We take that idea from the Greco-Roman terminology to represent sort of the high point of culture. The Greco-Roman classic era was a high point in European development, right? But then we apply that terminology here to those in what we call Mesoamerica and Latin America, South America rather. We won't get into explaining what that would really mean to say Latin America, which is what we call it now, but we're going to look at it before it was Latin America. It's South America. Essentially, we'll let them identify themselves. But there were three cultures that thrived in Mesoamerica during the Classic era, and the Zapotec culture would have been one, which was in the state of Oaxaca, what we would find in present-day Oaxaca. The influential civilization at Teotihuacan which is just north of present-day Mexico City. And then down in the south, we've got the Maya culture in the states of Yucatan and Chiapas and the countries of Belize and Guatemala. And we'll look at all three. The West thought of these cultures as, well, basically, backward, upside down, unsophisticated. But there were two separate calendars that came out of this area at this time. There may not have been domesticated animals for labor in some of the places. There was no wheel for human use. They didn't process bronze or iron, but they still could move 100-ton stones for temple building. So on the one hand, they weren't European, but in many ways they maybe did need to be sophisticated in what Europeans would think. They were able to accomplish quite a bit of really amazing feats just using the materials, resources, and technology at hand. But to look at the Zapotec culture first, they occupied what was known as Monte Alban in Oaxaca before the Mixtec. The Zapotec were closely tied to the Olmecs, as we said, the guys with the big heads, if you remember reading about them at some point. The Olmecs were kind of the alluvial lowlands of the Gulf Coast, but the Zapotec, they built high atop this mountain overlooking the three major valleys of central Oaxaca. Likely they were the first to use the 260-day calendar. They possessed a writing system. Apart from names, though, and dates in some places, it's pretty much remained undeciphered. We don't really know what their language says. They, much like the Olmecs and many others in these regions, valued jade higher than all other precious stones or metals, and the most precious stone throughout the history of Mesoamerica is jade. It was a translucent green, colored, symbolic of water and fertility and vegetation. It was like the symbol of the force of life. Large stones of jade were rare, but occasionally there would be some larger pieces. But a lot of times they would pass down through generational lines these smaller pieces of jade that would be important to families. Now, if you want to see a big piece of jade, we've got this jade bat god, which is not a common piece of jade that would be found. This would have been an example that was found in the grave of an early Zapotec king, probably worn as a symbol of his power. The eyes containing bits of a piece of shell that he maybe would have worn as a chest piece. So if you approached this king, you'd be staring dead into the face of this kind of gnarly looking bat god made of jade. But this would have been a highly sought after, very valuable piece of jade. This is very much so quite a important piece. But here we move on now to what we call Teotihuacan, which is an amazing culture that survived from 50 to 750 CE, Common Era, or AD, as you may call it. By the 4th century CE, this was the center of culture, comparable to maybe what we would have seen in Constantinople in the Old World, when Constantine took the seat, moved the city in place of where Istanbul was, and then calling it Constantinople. Kind of wasn't as highly, as sophisticated as Rome, but it was quite a feat for what they did. So maybe this would have been comparable to something like that. Teotihuacan remained as a holy site even in the later Mayan and Aztec periods. In fact, many important leaders of the Aztecs would make pilgrimages, up to 1,000 years after the collapse of this civilization. They'd go back to this place to, kind of as a pilgrimage, to return to this really important place where it was believed that it just wasn't just a city, but this was like kind of the origin of humankind. And they called this place, this manifestation on earth of Tolan, which was a mythic place of origin, where basically this was kind of like a Garden of Eden in a sense. This would have been thought to be like kind of where it all started. The city had, a huge grid system laid out, very intricate, detailed, based on, mathematical proportions that they were using kind of as a model throughout the construction of it all. Um, the city has a huge street here, as you can see. You can look at it from the other direction. You can it's called the Avenue of the Dead. So if you're walking into it, you have this huge street known as the Avenue of the Dead. It was about 2.5 miles long, and so this is the same picture as we started with, but going back the other way, you can kind of see it off down into the distance there. So this huge Avenue of the Dead was about 2.5 miles long, stretched all the way to between two pyramids. So it linked the Pyramid of the Moon and the Pyramid of the Sun. Both were surrounded, though, by maybe 600 smaller pyramids, workshops, numerous plazas, and a giant market area. About 2,000 known apartment complexes around in this city, decorated in ritualistic murals, and the distance of those apartments would have determined how sophisticated or culturally, or in a societal sense, like how where you were in society, what was your status. So if you were closer to the city, you were richer. If you were further away, then you were poorer. And the quality of the construction apparently would decrease the further you were from the city. So the Pyramid of the Sun marks the passage of the sun from the east to the west and the rising of a stellar constellation called the Pleiades on the days of the equinox. So it was intentionally positioned and oriented in such a way where it kind of captured that event. And another interesting connection of the pyramid with the sun was that there were two staircases, and each had 182 steps, which would total to, 363, right? Is that right? 4? No. So anyway, it would be 363, and then you take, so I'm going to add it up here, 182 times 2, 364. So the stairs came together at the very top, is what I'm trying to say here, and then there was one final step up onto the top. And so that would have made 365. Of course, that number sounds familiar because there's 365 days in a year. It was a solar calendar. It is worked around a solar calendar, just like we do. So the pyramid was an image of time. It represents this solar calendar. The same solar calendar representation can likewise be seen at the Temple of the Plumbed, or what we call the Feathered Serpent, which was decorated with 364 serpent fangs. So the height of Teotihuacan civilization was in about 500 CE. There were about 20,000 people living there. It would have been one of the largest cities in the world. Maybe not in terms of European sophistication, but definitely some sophistication. And then there's the Mayan. In the southern regions, we've got the Mayan culture, which were really interesting, very fascinating culture. They predated and postdated Teotihuacan. They occupied the highlands of Chiapas, as I said before, in Guatemala, the southern lowlands of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Belize, northern lowlands of the states of Yucatan, Campeche, and Quintana Roo. They never unified, actually, though interestingly, they always kind of stayed divided. They were not, they were actually fought against each other. If they would ever have unified, it's amazing to think what may have become of them. But they stayed sort of divided. They fought over land, they fought over resources, but they were very sophisticated. They had a very highly complex Mayan calendar here, and you may not be able to see all of the little explanations here, but these are what scholars have come to believe and understand all of the symbols represent. But really, you have two calendars in one. You've got a 365-day calendar, and you have a 260-day calendar. And so not only did it track their history, it's believed that they were able to predict the future. Of course, maybe you recall that many of us were duped into believing the Mayan calendar had predicted the end of the world, and then we all kind of waited for it to happen, and it didn't happen. Seems to happen like that a lot. Kind of reminds me of something about something that Jesus of Nazareth once said, that no one will know the day and the time. Anyway, so maybe anytime you hear someone say, this is the day that it's all going to end, you should just laugh, because it's probably not going to happen. Just saying. Hasn't worked, hasn't happened yet. And many people, many groups, many tribes, many people have declared that they knew the day and the time, but I doubt it. Didn't happen. So the calendar, though, consisted of the 365-day calendar, which is kind of like what we would be familiar with and understanding. And then they had a 260-day calendar, which is believed to have been maybe based on the period of human gestation. So from the time a woman has her last menses cycle, and then it's known that she's pregnant to the point of giving birth. And so it could be about 260 days. When both calendars sync together, it did this 52-year cycle, which is when the overlapping calendars would actually have a day called the same thing again. Does that make sense? It's kind of hard to explain, but it kind of rolls along. One's a bigger circle, because a bigger wheel, because it has more parts. More days, more counting devices, and as it rolls along the smaller 260-day, you have a series of combinations of symbols and days. So at the end of 52 years, it brought an end to this big cycle, and there would have been a celebration. Mayans wrote numbers in two ways. They had a system of dots and bars, and then they also had a set of pictorial variants. You would have seen both in the calendar. The Mayan actually had a concept of zero too, which was really ahead of its time, because it would be centuries later that Hindu mathematicians would discover this concept of zero in India. So though it's hard to, how do you discover zero, but to even have a concept of zero in your figure, in your mathematics, was ahead of its time. So one of the most important Mayan cities is called Palenque. And here we see an image of Palenque, and or maybe it's Palenque. No, it's Palenque. And this was actually lost for centuries after the decline in 850 CE, but it was rediscovered in 1746 by a Spanish priest who heard that this existed somewhere in the jungle, and he kind of sought it out, and lo and behold, he finds it, puts it on the map again, so to speak. It was thought to be maybe an administrative center rather than like a royal residence. Has 9 steps going up to the top, which is supposed to represent the 9 levels of the Mayan underworld. And inscribed on this structure, we find the history of the Palenque kings who were associated with the jaguar. First recorded king is Kukbalam, which was Quetzal jaguar, and inscriptions say that he actually was the one who founded the city in 431, March 11th, 431. Most powerful king would have been Kanich Jana Pakal I, which was also called the Great Sun Shield, known simply as Pakal, thankfully, so I don't have to try to say all that again. And he ruled 67 years. The temple inscriptions are erected over his grave, actually, and in 1952, Alberto Ruz, a Mexican archaeologist, found Pacal's tomb underneath the pyramid, got down in there, was able to discover Pacal buried with a jade death mask, saw that the tomb was actually ventilated so that he could have an eternity of fresh air, but also so that there could be a communication between the dead and the living, it is believed. Um, he was buried in a large uterus-shaped 5-ton stone sarcophagus that was covered in jade and cinnabar. Pretty interesting. A little bit now about Popol Vuh, which is a Mayan book of creation. It's written in Quiche, which is a surviving Mayan dialect that's still spoken in the Guatemala highlands. The Popol Vuh was produced between 1554 and 1558 by a Guatemalan Indian. Though there is, no mystery that there is a late dating to the text, it is thought to represent beliefs from about 1,000 years before it was written. About 1700, a Dominican priest by the name of Francisco Jimenez copied the manuscript from the Guatemalan Indian that was written in Quiche. He wrote a translation where it was Spanish on one side, Quiche on the other. The original manuscript is gone, but the parallel translation survived, and it was found in the archives of San Carlos University of Guatemala City by a man named Brasseur Bourberg, a French gentleman, and it was brought to Paris and published in 1858. It was then sold to Newberry Library in Chicago, along with some other of Bourberg's collections. It remained uncatalogued and unknown until 1941, but the Popol Vuh is an important text. It's in 4 parts, and it begins with the deeds of the Mayan gods in the darkness of the primeval sea. It's kind of a creation story. The gods try 3 times to create mankind, once out of animals, once out of mud, once out of wood, which the first 2 failed. The third one seemed to be successful, but didn't actually work out, and then the descendants of man became monkeys, which is a little interestingly different than perhaps what maybe one would think Darwinism teaches. I thought that was interesting, but Darwin was a modern scientist working in the modern age. Really, probably very little connection other than the irony. But so the rest of part 1 and part 2, all of part 2 of the Popol Vuh, deal with the set of hero twins. One is Hanhapu and Gbalanque. Those are the first set of twins. And then there's another set of twins. They're half-brothers, the monkey twins, that are Hun Bats and Hun Choin. Both sets of twins are ball players, summoned to the underworld, which is called Xibalba. So Hanhapu and Xibalba are tested, transformed, and resurrected. The Popol Vuh connects kind of the material and the immaterial world to the sport and the culture. Almost all major cities had this ball court at the time. Really quite an interesting game. If you read, it wasn't a game for fun. It was a game typically played by warriors, and if you lost, you were going to get your head cut off. And they had these skull racks where they would mount your head. It's a sign that you were the loser. So very intense sport. Nothing quite like what we would think. Street hoops might seem intense, but it was nothing compared to what one would have encountered in this sport. By 900 CE, Mayan culture collapses. So as a result of overpopulation, ecological degradation, political competition, war, just all the above, everything combined sort of leads to this collapse of Mayan culture. The surviving Maya just kind of fizzle out and return to the lands surrounding the great cities and become farmers. And that's kind of the story of the Maya. So the post-classic era, which would have been after the classic era, we have two groups that we're going to look at: the Toltecs and the Aztecs. After the decline of the Teotihuacan, the Toltecs rose to power. They were centered in Tula, in the modern state of Hidalgo. In terms of symbols, planning, narrative programs, and architecture, and the like, the Toltecs kind of build this bridge between this gap that would be between the Teotihuacan and the Aztec civilization. So they're kind of the interim civilization culture between those two. Of these groups, the Mexica survived later to be known as the Aztecs. There was actually, in the 12th century, Tula was burned, and its inhabitants just were scattered, and of those surviving was just the Mexica, who would go on to be the Aztecs. The Mexica wandered the wilderness looking. There's more to the story. I won't go into the depth of it. I think I do in another lecture, but they're wandering, trying to find their way, and they wander into the Valley of Mexico about 1325, and they build a village on the shores of Lake Texcoco. And there they see this, prophesied that they would see this, and they see an eagle perched upon this prickly pear cactus, which is actually the same symbol you would see in the center of the Mexican flag today. So about 1325, they build their village there. Seeing this promised sign that they should see, they determine they should wander no more, and they decide to set up a city here. And they drain parts of the lake, make it into fertile fields so that they can, carry out agriculture. And in the middle of the lake, there's an island, and that's where they build their city. Blood sacrifice was central to the Aztec culture, which was inherited from the Toltec warrior culture. Aztecs believed in the sun, the moon, and earth, that they depended on human blood. So their chief activity was war. Their chief goal was war, capturing, sacrificing, the people that they captured, that they would, win, and go to war, and it was to bring those people back so that they could sacrifice them. They would try to acquire territory and plunder goods because they had to support the Aztec elite culture back in their hometown. Boys would be trained for war from the age of puberty. They were living in warrior houses. They were being groomed for warfare. In only a few years, though, the Spanish somehow were able to come along and in 3 years basically annihilate the Aztec. Starting in 1519, they took all their gold, took it back to Europe to make money and to fund the endeavors of colonization of the world. The cultures of South America. We're going to look at that a little bit. Then we'll come to a close. The cultures of South America. So just like in Mesoamerica, there were also complex cultures developing down in South America. This would have, corresponded with the period of time in Europe's Middle Ages, specifically in present-day Peru. The Moche was a culture that flourished for about 1,000 years, from 200 BCE to 800 BCE. They built large temples, made of these adobe bricks that were sun-baked clay with straw to reinforce them, and they built some, huge, amazing temples as well. The largest temple is in the Moche Valley, which is called the Pyramid of the Sun, which is 1,000 feet long, 500 feet wide, and 59 feet tall. People buried their dead in these temples, along with many gold items, earrings, pendants, necklaces, ornaments, and all kinds of decorated ceramics and pots and pitchers and bottles and all kinds of really fascinating things. And many were preserved, and you can see some examples of that in your book too. The Inca are another interesting group that would have existed around 800 CE, um, which was about the point when, well, actually they wouldn't have existed 800 CE, but that would have been the very end of the Moche. They suddenly vanished. No one really knows why. There is thought to be maybe from floods, something that would have had to maybe been related to El Nino, which is a major shift in the weather, which causes flooding and heavy rains and climate change. But so there was actually a 400-year period between the end of the Moche in 800 CE. Sorry, there was a 400-year sort of no presence of culture, government, or politics in the area until 1300, and the Incas emerge. They were one of many farming cultures in the southern Peruvian highlands. The Inca took advantage of the llama, the alpacas, the vicuñas, and the guanacos, something that Mesoamerican cultures did not do. They used these animals to secure trade routes between the highlands and the lowlands. They also figured out how to irrigate the desert land between the highlands and the lowlands, thus creating kind of a rich agricultural region. They were master masons. They created centuries durable earthquake-proof structures. Most famous of all would be Machu Picchu. When I was in Peru last Christmas time, we were only in Lima, and the whole time I was there, everyone kept saying, "Oh, you have to go to Cusco. You have to see Machu Picchu." Unfortunately, we did not get to make it there, but it is on my list of things to do in this life. Looking forward to it. But here we have a picture of Machu Picchu. This would be the result of the exquisite master masonry of the Incan people. The capital city here of the Incan Empire is Cusco, which is where you find Machu Picchu. And Cusco literally means navel of the earth. They thought of it as kind of the center of the world. You have this immaculate Machu Picchu. You have stone buildings on this site that were designed as kind of a royal retreat for the Inca ruler Pachacuti Inca Yapunki, who built the complex between 1460 and 1470. It's believed that maybe probably about 1,200 people lived in Machu Picchu's, some 170 residences, men, women, children, and priests. They created extensive networks of roads, the Incans. Some of these roads were 50 feet wide, like a highway. Some of these roads were 3 feet wide, and they stretched from the desert to the Andes peaks for some 15,000 miles. There were approximately like 1,000 lodgings that were built along these routes. They had relay runners who would take messages and hustle them across this region and could, carry a message in like a week's time from one place to another. The Inca really liked textiles more than anything else, actually, because some of the high elevations caused for colder climates, and so it was more valuable to be warm than it would be to have gold or silver or some precious mineral or stone. So here you see a image of a weaved item, a textile. It's not really 100% clear to scholars what all the symbols mean, but it's thought to be that these symbols did in fact mean something. They were symbolic. So the llama was a really important part of the Inca culture because they were a source of wool to make the textiles. For one, they were considered a very important animal. They were used to transport. They were taken advantage of in that sense. They were what we would call a beast of burden. They did the hard work so the people didn't have to. Each morning and evening in Cusco, they would sacrifice a llama. The llama would also be paraded through the streets each April in expectation for the coming planting season. They would dress the llama up in a red tunic, put some gold jewelry on it, They'd have these grand processions that would have life-sized gold and silver llamas, people, and these big Inca gods. And unfortunately, none of it survives because the Spanish um, took it and melted it down and turned it into currency. Um, God symbols, gold God symbols, were also really important. Um, Even in Cusco, in the plaza, they dug up the dirt and they took it out and brought in sand from the ocean, from the beach, and in that sand they had scattered all of these gold medallions, these gold symbols for their gods, scattered throughout. Anyway, very rich, very fascinating culture that we see with the Incans, and Columbus and the Spanish came along, and they essentially, changed the world. Um, so there we go. There's your Mesoamerican, Latin American, pre-Columbus, what we'd call the classic era or period, and some of the post-classic, and we'll kind of stop at that point. There will be, ensuing lectures that will deal with what happened with the Spanish and the defeat of the Aztecs, and then, Mexico and the founding of Mexico, and that kind of evolution as well. But that's all for now.